back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of the era of Reconstruction, and in this lecture we'll talk about the politics of the Reconstruction era, particularly in the southern states as they were readmitted to the Union. Not long after the election of 1866, which ensured the heavily Republican Congress, the Radicals embarked on a crusade that would prove to be both the height of their power and in some ways their downfall, the impeachment of the president. Now, just to remind you, in case you're not familiar with impeachment, impeachment is like an indictment. You are brought to trial with the Senate serving as the jury in that trial. So impeachment does not mean that you are removed from office, although that is the process that could lead to removal from office. But essentially, this was the trial of Andrew Johnson before the Senate. Without getting into too much detail over the specific quote-unquote crime that he was impeached for, every president has the power to appoint and remove various officials. And so, to quickly summarize, he had removed one too many officials for the Republicans' taste under an act called the Tenure of Office Act, and he was impeached for that. But I've listed a slew of grievances that Republicans had against Andrew Johnson and the many reprehensible things he had done to impede Reconstruction in the South, to impede the quest for equality for blacks, and so on. What followed was a long, drug-out, painful, and bitter congressional battle, which ultimately came painfully close, within a vote or two of removing Johnson from office, but ultimately failed to remove him from office. So why did the impeachment of Andrew Johnson fail? There are many different reasons. Among them, that the crime that he was being accused of was not really defined very clearly throughout the trial. There were also those who were concerned that impeaching or removing the president would not just bring down Andrew Johnson, but would bring down the entire presidential office. There were also those who were concerned about his successor, who would be Benjamin Wade, who was the Speaker of the House and a radical Republican. You might recall I mentioned him as one of the proposers of the Wade-Davis bill. So some were opposed to him. We might also say that Andrew Johnson's lawyers did a great job in their trial. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, Andrew Johnson throughout the process of impeachment was quiet, which ultimately was what the Republicans wanted anyway. He had not done anything or done or said anything reprehensible over the course of the trial, and therefore the impeachment failed just by a vote or two. The failure of the impeachment was just one, and perhaps the first, in a series of events that began to chip away and bring down the influence of the radicals. They had been the staunchest supporters of black rights and also tried to enforce the harshest measures against the South. So with their decline, Northern control over the South diminished and ultimately became negligible. So why did the radicals decline? Well, for one, they were always small in number. I mentioned in the beginning, we were never dealing with a majority in Congress, a relatively small but influential group. Much of the popularity of the radicals was also rooted in the unpopularity of Andrew Johnson. So as I mentioned, once Johnson was silenced, the radicals lost some of their support. The radicals were themselves also divided on many issues. They were united on the issue of Reconstruction and equality for blacks. But on many other things they were divided, and so they had trouble maintaining control. They also had trouble staying in office, as any radical from any political bent would. Typically in this country you have to appeal to the majority, and so being too radical makes it hard to get elected or re-elected. A few of the key radicals died or were voted out of office, but Thaddeus Stevens died in 1868, just as this process was really getting going, Charles Sumner died in 1874. So again, we're dealing with a relatively small number of people, and so a handful of deaths chipped away at their influence. Some of them were dragged down by association with the various scandals of the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, which we'll talk about a little bit more a bit later. But these included scandals related to political appointments, favors to big businessmen, and to the railroads. And so Republicans in general were coming to be seen by some as scheming and greedy and unethical. Before fading out of power, the radical Republicans helped to usher through the 15th Amendment, which was ratified in 1870, and guaranteed voting rights for minorities. So the wording said it forbids the states to deny any citizen the right to vote on grounds of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So this is obviously intended to secure voting rights for the freedmen. After Andrew Johnson, the hero of the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant, was elected president in 1868. And while his tenure was one of the most scandal-ridden of any presidency, it was also under his presidency that Reconstruction reached its height. Under Grant, the Northern military oversaw constitutional conventions in most Southern states and assisted the Freedmen's Bureau in helping to register black voters throughout the South. We'll talk more about the Freedmen's Bureau in future lectures. During this period also, many white Southerners refused to vote. And so for a while, new groups were voted into positions of power in the South. You may have heard of groups like carpetbaggers, scalawags, and black politicians who held many positions in state and local leadership, and a handful even reached the United States Congress and Senate. Carpetbaggers were white Northerners who came to the South, often bringing with them money and resources. They get a bad reputation during this period for being exploitative, but they also brought capital, brought money and resources into the South that Southerners didn't necessarily have. Scalawags might be simply summarized as Southern Republicans. They were Southerners with sympathies for what the North was trying to do, perhaps sympathies for blacks. They might have had many reasons for working with Republicans, but they were also seen by other Southerners as traitors to their cause. And finally, there were black politicians. In terms of the National Congress and Senate, black politicians during this period never had a powerful influence. They were too few in number. They were divided on many issues. And of course, they were all relatively new to the process, so they didn't have time to establish the seniority that gets you appointed to positions of real influence in Congress. Nonetheless, overall during this period, there were 22 black congressmen, including 2 senators, a remarkable achievement for a group that had been denied power and in many cases denied education and just the basic necessities of life under the years of slavery. Republican Reconstruction had many shortcomings, which we'll discuss more toward the end of these lectures when we summarize the era of Reconstruction. But it also did accomplish many important things and had many positive aspects as well. It improved many public buildings, roads, and manufacturing. The northern capital and money brought into the South was able to do much of the actual physical rebuilding and reconstruction that Southerners could not do on their own. It also placed the public education system on a sound footing, and we'll talk more about that in a future lecture. It helped to build and create many social services that had not existed in the South before: orphanages, hospitals, social welfare, and so on. It also, again, brought large amounts of capital and investment into the South. in the form of those carpetbaggers and Northern money. And finally, as you see suggested in this political cartoon or drawing, it extended political democracy. There were many people able to vote in the Reconstruction era that had not been able to vote before, most pointedly blacks, who were not only able to vote but also able to run for office and in some cases, as I've described, to win office. So we're going to talk more about the overall legacies, successes, and failures of Reconstruction over the next few lectures.